In the year 1161, when the desert winds still carried echoes of the First Crusade's triumph, a child was born beneath the burning sky of Jerusalem. His name was Baldwin, son of Amalric I, king of Jerusalem, and Agnes of Courtenay, a woman whose beauty and ambition divided the royal court. None who witnessed his birth could have known that this frail boy would one day be called the Leper King, the last light before the darkness fell. Jerusalem, in the mid-12th century, was a miracle, balanced on a sword's edge. A Christian kingdom surrounded by powerful Muslim dynasties, its peace was fragile, held together by diplomacy, gold, and faith. Within its narrow streets, monks copied sacred texts, while merchants bargained over spices from Damascus. Pilgrims still walked barefoot to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, praying beside knights who guarded the same stones with drawn swords. Every sunrise felt like a borrowed gift. Young Baldwin was raised within this world of contradictions, holiness and war, devotion and decay. His tutor was William of Tyre, a scholar, priest, and historian whose eyes saw both the glory and the weakness of the kingdom. Under William's guidance, Baldwin studied Latin, scripture, and the art of kingship. He was quick of mind, sharp in speech, and unusually introspective. Yet his teacher noticed something that chilled him. When the boy played with other children, he did not flinch when bitten or bruised. He felt no pain. One afternoon, when Baldwin was about 9, William pressed his hand against the boy's arm and drove his fingernails into the skin. Baldwin did not react. "You feel nothing?" the tutor asked. The boy smiled, unaware of what his calmness meant. That moment, recorded in William's own chronicle, marked the beginning of a tragedy that would define an age. Baldwin was showing the first signs of leprosy, the disease that stripped sensation, flesh, and eventually life itself. But fate, it seemed, was not cruel without purpose. In the silence of suffering, Baldwin found discipline. His illness, though hidden from most, taught him patience beyond his years. While others his age dreamed of glory, he began to understand endurance, the hardest virtue of all. In time, that endurance would become his kingdom's last defense. When his father, Amalric IV, marched north on campaigns against Egypt, the young prince often watched him ride out from the city gates, sunlight glinting off his armor. Perhaps Baldwin knew even then that his own road would be shorter. Yet destiny had chosen him not to conquer, but to hold fast. And as the years turned and death came for his father in 1174, Jerusalem would once again need a king. Not a strong king, not even a whole one, but a king who could suffer and still rule and believe. The summer of 1174 hung heavy over Jerusalem. The heat shimmered above the limestone walls, and within the royal palace the air carried whispers of loss. King Amalric I was dead, taken suddenly by dysentery during a campaign in Egypt. His body was carried home under black banners through streets lined with monks chanting psalms. Behind him walked courtiers and knights whose faces were shadowed by more than grief. They knew the crown now passed to a child, a boy barely 13, his skin pale, his hands already marked by disease. Baldwin, son of Amalric and Agnes of Courtenay, stood before the throne in silence. His father's crown gleamed beside him, heavy with gold and expectation. Around him gathered men far older, each with ambitions of their own. Raymond III of Tripoli, cautious and shrewd, Miles of Plancy, ambitious and ruthless, and the military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, whose swords served both God and power. The kingdom trembled not because its enemies were near, but because it did not yet know who truly ruled within. On 15th July 1174, the people of Jerusalem gathered beneath the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The day had been chosen with divine symbolism. 75 years to the day since the Crusaders first captured the city from Muslim hands. It was meant to remind the faithful that God's will still watched over them. Yet, as Baldwin knelt before the altar, the echo of history felt fragile. The boy was small, thin, and pale beneath his golden hair. When the archbishop placed the crown upon his head, it seemed to rest not on strength, but on faith alone. William of Tyre, now Chancellor of the kingdom, described the moment with quiet sorrow. He was most handsome in appearance, but the marks of the disease were already visible upon him. Behind the ritual splendor, the burning incense, the Latin hymns, the banners of the cross, there was a growing awareness among the nobles. This was not the coronation of a conqueror, but of a martyr in waiting. Because Baldwin was still a minor, the throne required a guardian. The kingdom's barons quarreled over who would hold real power. Miles of Plancy, seneschal of Jerusalem, briefly seized control as regent. Ruling with arrogance and suspicion, he alienated the nobles and ignored the boy king's counsel. But in the chaos of ambition, justice came swiftly. Later that same year, Miles was assassinated in the streets of Acre. Power passed instead to Raymond III of Tripoli, Baldwin's cousin, and one of the last great lords of the first Crusader generation. Where Miles had ruled with pride, Raymond governed with cautious dignity. Under his regency, the fragile kingdom held together. The Muslim world, though united under Saladin, had not yet struck in full force, and so Jerusalem breathed, uncertainly, but still alive. Baldwin watched and learned. Though confined by his illness, he attended councils, listening more than he spoke. His tutors noticed his growing calm, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of someone already acquainted with pain. At nights, when the city quieted, he would climb to the palace roof with his servants and look toward the Mount of Olives. The lights of campfires from distant Saracen patrols flickered on the horizon. He knew their commander's name, Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, and he knew that one day their fates would meet. The boy who could not feel pain would one day face the man the world would call merciful. By 1176, Baldwin had reached his legal majority. Though still weak in body, he declared that he would rule in his own right. It was a decision that shocked the court. Many assumed his leprosy would make him unfit to reign. But Baldwin, calm as ever, summoned his council and spoke simply, "If God wills me to live, I will reign. If he wills me to die, I will die as king." That moment marked the birth of a legend. The boy no longer hid behind his regent's authority. He rode out to inspect his castles, meeting with the Templar masters at Gaza, Ascalon, and Kerak. He ordered fortifications repaired, trade routes reopened, and new knights sworn to his cause. His condition worsened, his fingers stiffened, his face paled, yet his mind remained sharp, and his courage unbroken. Chroniclers would later say that Baldwin's reign was proof that kingship was not a matter of flesh, but of spirit. As the year turned, the court began to divide into factions, one favoring his mother's influence through the Courtenays, another backing Raymond of Tripoli, and a third supporting the Templars' ambitions. Baldwin stood at the center of it all, frail yet unyielding. He had no army of his own, no strength to swing a sword, and yet he commanded loyalty through something rarer, dignity. Men who met him came away changed, ashamed of their pettiness. His calm gaze, sunken and feverish, seemed to pierce through them. "He looked as if already half in heaven," wrote one visiting knight, "and yet his will was stronger than ours." As he entered his 15th year, Baldwin began to rule without regency. His first act was to renew the treaties his father had forged, with Byzantium to the north and the county of Tripoli to the west. But even as he sought peace, the shadow of Saladin grew taller. The Sultan, having united Egypt and Syria, now looked south toward the Holy City. Scouts brought word of his armies massing near the frontier fortresses. Baldwin, though barely able to mount a horse, began preparations for war. He understood what few in his court yet saw, that the age of Christian dominance was ending, and that Jerusalem stood at the edge of a storm. And so, the child who could not feel pain began his reign surrounded by those who had never known endurance. His illness would consume him, but his courage would soon define him. Before his 17th year, he would face Saladin himself and ride diseased and dying into one of the most miraculous victories of the Middle Ages. The boy king had been crowned in faith. The man would be baptized in fire. By the autumn of 1177, the air in Jerusalem trembled with rumor. From the south came reports of Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, marching north with an army so vast that the desert seemed to move with him. Chroniclers wrote that his host numbered 26,000, some say even more, a tide of cavalry, banners, and flame. His purpose was clear: to strike at the heart of the Crusader kingdom, to crush the boy king whose crown rested on fragile bones. King Baldwin IV was only 16. His body, ravaged by leprosy, had grown frail. His fingers stiffened. His feet were numb. He could ride only with support, wrapped in layers of linen beneath his armor. Yet, when word reached him that Saladin had crossed into the coastal plains near Ramla, Baldwin did not hesitate. Against the counsel of his barons, he called for his knights. "We will meet him," he said, his voice calm, "before he meets us." The odds were madness. Baldwin could muster barely 500 knights and perhaps 3,000 infantry, supported by a contingent of Templars under Odo de Saint-Amand, the order's Grand Master. Saladin's army outnumbered them more than 5-1. Even the wind seemed to favor the Sultan, blowing hot from the south and filling the sky with dust. But Baldwin's faith was his armor. "The Lord will not let his city fall," he told his men, "not while we can still raise a sword." On 25th of November, 1177, under a merciless sun, the two forces met near a small hill called Montgisard, between Ramla and Ibelin. The plain was dry and open, no place to hide, no walls to defend. It was here, in the full sight of heaven, that a boy who could barely grip his reins prepared to fight the most feared general of the age. The night before the battle, Baldwin ordered his tent turned into a chapel. He had the true cross brought from Jerusalem, the relic said to contain a fragment of Christ's crucifixion. The priests held it aloft before the soldiers as they knelt in the sand. Baldwin removed his helmet and kissed the wood, his lips trembling. "We ride tomorrow," he whispered, "not for glory, but for grace." At dawn, the wind changed. A cool breeze swept across the plain, carrying away the dust. Saladin's columns advanced in confidence, their banners green and gold against the pale sky. His scouts reported no strong resistance ahead. He believed Baldwin's army scattered, his city defenseless. The Sultan rode at the center, surrounded by his Mamluk guard, certain of victory. But the boy king had hidden his troops in a ravine near Montgisard's slopes, waiting. When the Muslim vanguard approached, Baldwin gave the signal. Trumpets blared, hooves thundered, and from the dry hills the cross of Jerusalem rose like a sudden flame. Baldwin rode at the front, the true cross held high before him, the sunlight glinting off its golden casing, his knights crying, Deus vult! God wills it! Charged with such fury that Saladin's front ranks shattered. The Templars slammed into the flanks, their white mantles streaked with blood and dust. Baldwin's small host fought as if the angels themselves were at their backs. Saladin's army, stretched and unprepared, panicked. The Sultan tried to rally his men, but chaos swept through his camp. The Christian charge drove deep into the heart of the Muslim line, cutting down banners and breaking supply trains. Chroniclers wrote that Baldwin's armor shone like a beacon upon a mountain, though his attendants had to support him in the saddle, his hands too weak to lift his sword. Yet he refused to retreat. "Let them see their king," he said, "even if he cannot strike." By mid-afternoon, Saladin's army collapsed. The Sultan himself barely escaped, pursued to the gates of Ascalon. His nephew and many of his emirs were slain. Hundreds of his soldiers drowned in the marshes as they fled toward Egypt. The plains of Montgisard were left strewn with corpses and broken standards. Against all reason, the kingdom of Jerusalem, led by a dying boy, had defeated the greatest general of the Islamic world. When Baldwin rode back to Jerusalem, the people poured into the streets. Bells rang across the city. The chronicler William of Tyre wrote, "The Lord wrought through him a miracle greater than any in our time." Baldwin ordered prayers of thanksgiving in every church. He did not claim glory for himself. He could barely stand. But he smiled as he entered the church of the Holy Sepulchre once more. "God has not abandoned his city," he said softly. Yet behind the celebration lay exhaustion. The victory at Montgisard, though miraculous, did not break Saladin's power. The Sultan retreated, learned, and rebuilt. Baldwin, meanwhile, returned weaker than before. His hands could no longer hold a sword. His face, once youthful, now bore the scars of disease. But his name had become legend. To his people, he was the living proof that faith could conquer flesh. In Cairo, Saladin's court reeled in humiliation. The Sultan himself, far from enraged, seemed almost reflective. "It was not the boy who defeated us," he said to his emirs. "It was the God he believes in." From that day, Saladin never again underestimated the sick king of Jerusalem. The two men, opposites in every way, would come to respect one another more deeply than any of their allies understood. In the months that followed, Baldwin oversaw repairs to the fortresses near Gaza and strengthened the defenses of Ascalon and Kerak. He appointed trusted commanders to guard the borders while he focused on governance. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind remained alert. He met envoys from Byzantium, renewed trade treaties, and personally inspected the relics of the true cross that had ridden with him into battle. Montgisard would be the brightest flame of Baldwin's short life. It was victory bought with suffering, a moment of divine defiance in a world falling to ruin. From that day onward, the people of Jerusalem whispered his name with reverence, not as the leper, but as the chosen. Yet in every miracle lies a shadow. For each triumph in the Holy Land, the sands would take their due. Saladin would return stronger, and Baldwin's body would continue to crumble. His reign would become a race against death, a struggle not for conquest, but for time. And though he could not know it yet, Montgisard had not saved his kingdom. It had only postponed its fate. The years after his miraculous victory at Montgisard brought no relief for Baldwin IV. Even as the cheers faded, the kingdom's storms multiplied. Internal fractures cracked the facade of power, and his body betrayed him more visibly than ever. In the deep summer of 1178, the pale young king in Jerusalem felt first the full weight of his condition. The sins of the body are seldom silent. They announce themselves in the infirm, in the limp, in the graying of hair once bright under crusader helmets. Baldwin's illness advanced. The chronicler William of Tyre observed, "His face, once fair, began to show the marks of the disease. His fingers lost their sense. He hesitated when rising from his horse." Encyclopedia Britannica, already obscure signs, his arm unfeeling at 9, his stiffness at 15, now became visible. The whitened rims around his eyes, the hesitant step, the guarded smile. Leprosy in those days meant shame as much as sickness. A body separated from contact, a king separated from full strength. Yet Baldwin would not withdraw. In early 1179, Saladin pressed the frontiers. On 10th of June 1179, the armies clashed at Battle of Marj Ayun. Baldwin's forces, his knights and infantry, met Saladin's Ayyubid troops on the slopes north of Lake Tiberias. By then the disease limited the king's mobility. He no longer could lead the charge from horseback with confidence. Nevertheless, he was present in the field, but the Christian army faltered, ill-aroused, mispositioned, too reliant on past glories. The result was disastrous. A heavy defeat for the Crusaders, a blow to the kingdom's morale. Wikipedia +1. The loss exposed two vulnerabilities. First, Baldwin's physical weakness restricted more than his body. It limited his options. He could still strategize, still counsel, but the sight of his attendants carrying him into camp eroded the image of unshakable kingship. Second, the nobles of Jerusalem sensed it. The regency, which had once surrounded the young king, now fractured into factions. Raymond III of Tripoli, ambitious and wary. The Templar and Hospitaller orders, their own independent power centers, the Courtenay kin group of Baldwin's mother Agnes, all pushed for influence. Baldwin felt the isolation of his crown deepen even as he carried it. At home, the barons muttered about marriages and succession. Baldwin, though still a teenager, watched his sister Sibylla of Jerusalem grow into womanhood, and the question of heirs haunted the palace. He knew his days were numbered, so he strove to control the narrative. He ordered the coffers audited. He pressed for fortifications to be repaired. He insisted the usual ceremonies go ahead, as though nothing threatened the throne. In the corridors of power, he became not just a king, but a symbol of resistance to disease, to defeat, to decline. Meanwhile, Saladin's raid campaigns ravaged Galilee and the eastern frontiers. In 1180, the truce between the Crusader kingdom and Egypt, held only by the king's insistence, not by substance, raids, skirmishes, and the silent shifting of power across the Jordan made defense an endurance test rather than a triumph. Baldwin ordered the construction and reinforcement of castles, among them places like Kerak and Montreal in Transjordan, fortresses that could hold even if the field army could not ride out. His strategy shifted. When you cannot always meet the foe in open battle, You must blunt his advance by walls and watchers. Still, pressure mounted. The year 1182 would witness the next general confrontation, the Battle of Belvoir Castle, Le Forbelet, in July 1182. Wikipedia plus. But before the dawn of that fight, Baldwin's body turned traitor. Blindness began to claim his sight, numbness his limbs. He rode still, but only with supports. He gave commands, but from litter or chair. His attendants fashioned his garments to hide the rings and deformities. For the court, the king's presence remained. For many soldiers, the king's strength was no longer unquestioned. In the quiet hours, Baldwin faced his truth. It is said he asked his chaplain, "When I die, where will the cross rest?" In his heart, he was not a conqueror. He was a defender. His kingdom was not a chosen path, but a burden. And even while preparing forts and armies, he prepared his soul. He knew that Jerusalem's fate might not hinge on swords and shields, but on time. And time was slipping away. In the interplay of physical decay and political storm, Baldwin's character crystallized. Some saw the Leper King as tragic, others as saint-like. To the Templars, his courage was proof that faith endured even when flesh failed. To Raymond's nobles, his early insistence on rule created long-term tensions. But no one denied the spectacle. A teenage king leading men into danger with bandaged hands, riding a horse as the sun rose over the holy city, rallying his people by his presence alone. As the summer of 1179 faded, the kingdom held, for now. More castles stood, more roads guarded, more eyes watching the hills of Jordan for the green banners of Saladin. Yet inside the fortress of Jerusalem itself, the clamor of succession and the whisper of demise grew louder. The king who could not feel pain in his limbs now felt the weight of every decision. The victory was past, the struggle ongoing, the body failed, the kingdom would soon follow. And so Baldwin moved forward, a king on borrowed time, ruling a realm perched on the brink. The horizon, once a promise, now was a warning. By 1180, Baldwin IV was no longer a boy. He was 20, a king seasoned by war and suffering, his crown tarnished by both victory and disease. The miracle of Montgisard had become legend, but legends could not hold cities together. Now, as his sight dimmed and the feeling drained from his hands, Baldwin faced his most relentless enemy, time. The leprosy had advanced with cruel precision. It had blinded one eye, stiffened his fingers, and left his feet nearly useless. He was carried to councils in a litter, wrapped in silks to hide the decay of his skin. When he spoke, courtiers listened, not out of pity, but reverence, for Baldwin's voice, though weakened, carried the weight of calm authority. He had become more spirit than flesh, more symbol than ruler, and his enemies knew it. The kingdom he ruled, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, was shrinking. Saladin had united Egypt and Syria under his banner and now turned his gaze southward again. The frontiers along the Jordan trembled under constant raids. Caravans burned, fortresses tested their walls daily. But within Jerusalem's own walls, the greater danger was intrigue. The barons had begun maneuvering for power in the shadow of the dying king. The question on every noble's lips was the same: who will rule when Baldwin is gone? The answer, by law, lay with his sister Sibylla, widowed and still young, but her remarriage had turned the court into a battlefield. In the spring of 1180, Baldwin made a decision that would haunt him. To prevent civil war between two rival factions, one supporting Count Raymond III of Tripoli, the other the powerful Courtenay family, he allowed Sibylla to marry Guy de Lusignan, a French knight recently arrived from Poitou. Guy was handsome, ambitious, and well connected to Western nobility, but he was untested and vain. To many lords he seemed unworthy of the royal bloodline he would soon claim. Baldwin hoped the marriage would unify his court. Instead, it deepened its fractures. By 1181, Saladin broke the truce. His raiders swept across Galilee and the Transjordan fortresses. Despite his blindness, Baldwin ordered his men to assemble. Carried in a litter at the head of his army, he commanded from beneath a canopy of crimson silk. Witnesses wrote that his face shone as pale as linen, yet as resolute as iron. He could no longer wield a sword, but he could wield faith. His presence on the battlefield, this fragile figure, wrapped and bandaged, raising his trembling hand in blessing, transformed fear into zeal. That year's campaign brought small but vital victories. Saladin's raiders were beaten back from Montreal and Quebec, their supply lines harried by Frankish patrols. But the Sultan's strategy had shifted. Rather than seek one decisive battle, he aimed to exhaust his enemy, bleeding the kingdom slowly until its defenses and its king collapsed together. He knew Baldwin's illness was incurable. He could afford to wait. At court, Baldwin's faith in Guy de Lusignan eroded. The new prince consort proved reckless and arrogant. When he led a force into Samaria in 1182, he ignored orders and nearly lost his army in a disastrous encounter with Saladin's cavalry. The king's patience broke. In a moment that stunned his barons, Baldwin stripped Guy of command and named him unfit to rule. It was the first time the dying monarch publicly admitted that he could not trust his own heir. To preserve the line of succession, he declared Sibylla's young son, Baldwin V, co-king under his regency. The sight of a blind leper placing the crown upon a child's head was both tragic and holy, the living passing duty to the innocent. The following months saw the last campaigns personally commanded by Baldwin IV. In July 1182, word came that Saladin had crossed the Jordan again, marching toward the fortress of Belvoir Castle. The king's physicians begged him to remain in Jerusalem. His body was fevered, his hands blackened from infection. He refused. "I will not hide behind walls while my people fight in the field," he said. They carried him on a litter into battle once more. At Belvoir, the armies clashed for 2 days under a searing sun. Saladin's forces, confident of victory, met a disciplined Frankish defense. Though Baldwin could no longer see the banners, he ordered every move by memory and intuition. Messengers rode from his tent to the front lines, carrying commands he dictated through the pain. When the Templars countercharged, driving the Muslim cavalry from the hills, Baldwin ordered his trumpets blown, a signal of triumph. The Sultan withdrew, his attack repelled. For the last time in his life, the Leper King had turned back Saladin. He returned to Jerusalem on a stretcher, barely conscious. The people lined the streets to touch the cloth of his litter, believing contact might bring blessing. In the churches, priests compared him to Job, enduring affliction with unwavering faith. To the nobles, he was now more saint than sovereign, a reminder that leadership could outlast flesh. Still, he governed. In late 1182, Baldwin called a great council in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He ordered new fortifications for Ascalon, reorganized the treasury, and reaffirmed the rights of the military orders. Even as his voice faltered, He negotiated with Byzantium for naval aid and sent envoys to the west, pleading for reinforcements. No crusade came. Europe had grown tired, its kings preoccupied with their own quarrels. Jerusalem was a miracle far away, defended now by a man who could no longer walk. That winter, his pain became constant. He rarely slept. When he did, attendants kept vigil to ensure he still breathed. Yet his mind remained alert. He dictated letters to his sister, to the Templar Grand Master, even to Saladin himself, seeking truce and mercy for his people. God has given me the crown of thorns, he told his chaplain, and I will wear it until he takes it from me. By the end of 1182, the balance of power was shifting irreversibly. Saladin, undeterred, rebuilt his army. The nobles of Jerusalem whispered of succession. The king, who had once saved the Holy Land at Montgisar, now ruled from his bed, his flesh failing, but his faith unbroken. In the silent corridors of his palace, Baldwin IV lingered, neither fully living nor dying, a man suspended between heaven and earth. He had become the kingdom's conscience, its embodiment of endurance. His disease was not a curse anymore, it was his crown. The spring of 1183 came early that year, hot winds from the Jordan Valley rising over Jerusalem's ramparts, whispering of invasion. The scouts brought grim news. Saladin, now commanding a united empire from the Nile to the Euphrates, was marching north once again. His banners of green and gold flowed across the plains of Galilee. He had sworn that this time he would break the kingdom of Jerusalem for good. Inside the holy city, the Leper King prepared for war. Baldwin IV was 22. His eyes were blind, his hands stiff and wrapped in bandages, his legs useless. Yet he still ruled. The courtiers who once pitied him now obeyed him with awe. He sat upright in his chair of state, the gold crown glinting above a face grown thin and pale. "My body is the shell of a man," he said quietly, "but my soul still stands." To meet Saladin's invasion, Baldwin summoned every banner of Christendom left in the East. The knights of Tripoli, the men of Antioch, and the warrior monks of the Templar and Hospitaller orders. He named his estranged brother-in-law, Guy de Lusignan, commander of the field army, though his confidence was fragile. The decision was born of necessity more than trust. Baldwin could no longer ride, and Guy was the highest noble of military rank. By early October, Saladin's army crossed the Jordan, pillaging the fields of Galilee and laying siege to Kerak Castle, a fortress of staggering height, built by the king's own mother's kin. The Sultan intended not just to seize the stronghold, but to humiliate the ailing monarch who still defied him. When word reached Jerusalem, Baldwin ordered his army to assemble at once. The council protested. His doctors begged him not to leave the city. He was feverish, near blind, carried everywhere in a litter. "Your Majesty cannot even stand," one bishop pleaded. Baldwin smiled faintly. "Then I will sit before my enemies." They carried him from the palace on a bier draped in white linen. His armor hung loose on his body, his sword borne by a squire. Before him rode the true cross, gleaming in the sun. The people of Jerusalem lined the streets, many weeping as the king passed, a ghost of the boy who had once ridden through them in triumph. "Pray not for my life," he whispered to a priest beside him, "but that I die useful." At Kerak, the siege raged. Saladin's engineers had surrounded the castle, hurling stones from great mangonels and building siege towers against its walls. Within, Princess Isabella Baldwin's half-sister, was trapped, newly married to Humphrey IV of Turon. When the Sultan learned that the wedding feast continued inside the fortress despite his bombardment, he smiled in admiration and ordered that no catapult stone be aimed at the bridal tower, an act of chivalry that history would remember. Baldwin's relief army reached the plateau above Montreal in mid-November 1183. Carried into the command tent, he ordered the banners arrayed in full view of the enemy. Saladin's scouts reported that the Leper King himself had come. That sight, the dying monarch still leading from the front, shook the Sultan's men more deeply than any sword charge. "If he has the courage to come like this," one emir is said to have murmured, "then surely his God rides with him." The two armies faced each other for 3 days across the wind-swept hills of Moab. Neither side dared the first blow. Both understood the cost of a pitched battle. Saladin finally withdrew toward Damascus, leaving Kerak relieved and its defenders cheering from the walls. Baldwin had achieved the impossible again, victory by presence alone. But the triumph cost him dearly. The journey home broke what remained of his strength. Fever consumed him, and the open sores on his hands refused to heal. In 1184, his council begged him to appoint a regent permanently. He consented reluctantly, naming Raymond III of Tripoli as baili, or protector of the realm, to govern until his young nephew Baldwin IV came of age. For the first time, the king acknowledged that his reign was ending. That spring, he met Patriarch Heraclius in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Those who witnessed the scene never forgot it. The king, his face covered in white veils, was carried before the high altar. When the veil slipped and the congregation saw the ravages of the disease, the discolored skin, the hollowed eyes, many fell to their knees in tears. Baldwin lifted his bandaged hands and blessed them. "I have nothing left," he said, "save the city of God. Keep it, even when I am gone." Meanwhile, diplomacy reached its last delicate hour. Baldwin sent letters across Europe, to Philip II of France, to Henry II of England, even to the Pope, pleading for a new crusade. He dictated each message through pain and fever, urging the West not to abandon the Holy Land. The responses came too slow, too distant. Europe was preoccupied with its own wars. Baldwin's call for help faded like incense in an empty nave. In 1185, his final winter descended. The disease had blinded him completely. His voice grew faint, his breathing labored. The palace physicians prepared medicines of myrrh and aloe, but nothing eased the agony. He could not bear the touch of clothing. Only his confessor and his most trusted knight, Reginald of Sidon, remained at his bedside. "The crown weighs little now," he whispered one night, "yet it feels heavier than ever." Knowing the end was near, Baldwin summoned the court one last time. In the audience hall of the Tower of David, they carried him upon his litter and set him upright, so that the crown still gleamed above his ruined face. Before the assembled nobles, he declared his nephew Baldwin IV the sole heir and demanded they swear fealty to the child. Even his enemies bowed. No one dared defy a man who had turned suffering into sanctity. A few weeks later, a storm swept the holy city. The sky darkened, thunder rolling over the Mount of Olives. In the royal chapel, candles guttered as Baldwin's breathing slowed. He asked for the true cross to be brought once more to his bedside. Placing his withered hand upon it, he murmured a final prayer for the kingdom he had defended with the remnants of his body. "Let the Lord's will be done," he said. "I have kept faith." King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died in the early months of 1185, probably in March, at the age of 24. He had reigned 11 years. His body, wrapped in white linen and royal cloth of gold, was carried through the streets of Jerusalem amid tolling bells and weeping crowds. The chroniclers record that even the Saracens along the frontier mourned him, for he had been a worthy foe. Saladin himself, when told of the Leper King's passing, bowed his head and said, "There never was a more gallant prince." They buried Baldwin before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, near the tombs of his father and forefathers. His epitaph, carved in Latin, read simply, "Here lies Baldwin, King of Jerusalem, who triumphed over his flesh." With his death, the fragile peace he had held together began to unravel. Within 2 years, the kingdom would fall to factional strife, and Saladin would march again, this time to Hattin and the loss of the holy city itself. But Baldwin's memory endured, shining like a candle against the coming dark. For he had shown the world that kingship is not the absence of pain, but the mastery of it. His reign, though brief, was a sermon in endurance. A blind, dying boy who faced the mightiest empire of his age and would not kneel. And long after his bones turned to dust beneath Jerusalem's stones, the pilgrims who came to pray at his tomb whispered the same words, "The Leper King still guards the city." When King Baldwin IV was laid to rest in March 1185, Jerusalem fell silent. The city, that had once echoed with the clang of swords and the chant of psalms, now trembled under the weight of absence. He had been the kingdom's soul, its frail shield against chaos, and with his death, something larger than a man passed away. No trumpets announced it, no chronicles could measure it, yet every heart in the holy city felt it. The age of steadfast faith had ended. They buried him in a plain sarcophagus before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, beside his father, Amalric I. The inscription carved above read in austere Latin, "Hic jacet Balduinus leprosus, rex Jerusalem, qui triumphavit de corpore." Here lies Baldwin the leper, king of Jerusalem, who triumphed over his body. It was the most fitting epitaph a man of his kind could have. He had ruled by spirit when flesh had long deserted him. The news of his passing spread quickly across the Levant. From Damascus to Cairo, the Muslim chroniclers who had once called him the Boy King now wrote his name with respect. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, Saladin's secretary, recorded, "He was wise, firm, and courageous beyond his years. Though struck with disease, he never yielded to weakness." Even Saladin himself, upon hearing that his great adversary was gone, is said to have murmured, "A prince who, had he been healthy, might have shaken the world." Such words, uttered by an enemy, endure longer than any carved in stone. For Jerusalem, his death was not only a loss of a ruler, but the collapse of a delicate balance. He had held together rival factions through sheer moral gravity. His regency plan, naming his young nephew Baldwin IV as successor under Count Raymond III of Tripoli's guidance, lasted scarcely 2 years. The boy king died in 1186, and with him vanished Baldwin IV's last safeguard against the chaos he had foreseen. The vacuum that followed swallowed the kingdom whole. His sister Sibylla reclaimed the crown and raised her husband Guy de Lusignan to kingship, a man Baldwin had once denounced as unfit to rule. Within a year, the very calamity the Leper King had dreaded came to pass. Guy's arrogance and impulsive pride led the Crusader army into the arid hills near the Sea of Galilee, where Saladin's forces surrounded them. On 4th July 1187, At the Battle of Hattin, the Christian host was annihilated. The true cross, the same relic Baldwin had carried to victory at Montgazar, was seized and paraded through Saladin's camp as a trophy. 3 months later, the Sultan entered Jerusalem, ending nearly 9 decades of Latin rule. To many, the city's fall confirmed Baldwin's warnings that faith without discipline and courage without unity would doom them all. In the chronicles written afterward, William of Tyre's Historia, Ernul's Chronique d'Ernul, the Arab historians of Saladin's court, Baldwin IV emerged not as a tragic invalid, but as the last true king of Jerusalem. He became a symbol of nobility's twilight, a mirror held up to both sides of the Holy War. The West, when news reached it, reacted with sorrow and awe. Pilgrims at Rome whispered of the Saint King of Jerusalem. Monks in France copied tales of his courage into manuscripts beside the lives of martyrs. Even centuries later, troubadours would sing of the youth who, though blind and dying, led armies in God's name. The image endured because it defied reason. A diseased boy defeating the greatest general of his time through faith alone. Modern historians have called him many things: a miracle, a martyr, a strategist trapped in a failing body. What made Baldwin IV extraordinary was not his victories, but his ability to hold power through reverence, not fear. He inspired obedience by quiet example. He never ruled through cruelty, nor stained his reign with needless executions. His justice was tempered by humility, his diplomacy by understanding. He wrote letters to Muslim rulers in tones of courtesy rather than hatred, recognizing that his enemies were also men of conviction. In that, he was centuries ahead of his time. His reign, brief as it was, illuminated a paradox. That weakness, when borne with courage, can command more strength than armies. The very disease that might have rendered him powerless instead gave him moral authority. His sores became symbols of sacrifice, his blindness a metaphor for faith that sees beyond sight. Even his enemies could not help but feel that the leper's pain sanctified his cause. Archaeologists later found the remains of his tomb damaged during the Ottoman period, yet fragments of the inscription survive, letters worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' fingers. Some accounts say that crusaders of the Third Crusade, men of Richard the Lionheart, paused at his grave before marching north. They prayed not for victory, but for steadfastness like his. One English knight wrote in his diary, "If we had such a king again, the cross would not have fallen." Beyond legend, Baldwin's political legacy shaped the course of the later Crusades. His insistence on fortifying Querrac, Montreal, and Ascalon delayed Saladin's conquest for almost a decade. His early diplomacy with Byzantium and the northern Crusader states created temporary unity that no successor could maintain. In truth, it was Baldwin's foresight, not Guy's folly, that determined how long the kingdom endured. Without his defenses and treaties, Jerusalem might have fallen years earlier. His reign also transformed medieval perceptions of leprosy itself. Before Baldwin, the disease marked sinners and outcasts. After him, it could mark saints. Chroniclers wrote that he bore his affliction with the patience of Job and the purity of a confessor. Later, medieval texts compared him to the suffering Christ, a king whose broken body redeemed his people through endurance. Hospitals for lepers, once isolated, began receiving donations under his name. In that sense, Baldwin's pain became a form of healing. Even the modern world has not forgotten him. Writers and filmmakers have returned to his story as one of paradoxical majesty, most famously in Kingdom of Heaven, 2005, where he appears as the silver-masked monarch, serene and introspective. Though dramatized, the portrayal captured something true, that Baldwin's authority was not of the sword, but of spirit, that his illness made him transcendent rather than tragic. Yet the real Baldwin IV was not a myth in armor or a masked saint. He was a boy who discovered at 13 that he could not feel pain in his hand. A youth who led knights into battle while his body disintegrated. A man who, in the face of certain death, kept ruling so others might live free. He laughed with his courtiers, argued with his barons, planned campaigns with meticulous care. He was human, which is precisely why his courage still moves us. Historians often measure rulers by what they conquer. Baldwin IV conquered nothing permanent, no new lands, no wealth, no empire. But he achieved something rarer. He conquered despair. His victories at Montgisard, Belvoir, and Carac were not just battles against Saladin, but against the slow annihilation of the flesh. Each time he rose from his sickbed to lead, he reminded the world that faith could make even ruin luminous. When later generations tried to explain how the kingdom of Jerusalem survived so long surrounded by enemies, they often began with a single phrase found in a 13th century chronicle. Because one man refused to die before his duty was done. That, perhaps, is Baldwin IV's truest epitaph. For in every age since, from chroniclers' quills to the quiet prayers of pilgrims, his story whispers the same lesson, that greatness is not freedom from suffering, but faith within it, not victory without loss, but dignity within defeat. And somewhere beneath the stones of the Holy Sepulchre, if you listen closely, you can almost hear his last vow echoing still. I have kept the faith. When King Baldwin IV died in 1185, the holy city still gleamed under desert light, its towers proud against the horizon. But within 2 short years, the kingdom he had held together through sheer will began to crack like sun-baked stone. The last breath of the Leper King had barely faded before ambition filled the silence he left behind. His young successor, Baldwin IV, a child barely 8 years old, reigned only months before illness carried him off in 1186. With his death, the delicate balance Baldwin IV had built collapsed. His sister Sibylla seized the crown, ignoring the oaths sworn to the boy king's regents. Against every warning her brother had given, she placed it on the head of her husband, Guy de Lusignan, the same man Baldwin IV had once called unfit to rule even himself. Thus, the kingdom's fate passed into reckless hands. At first, the court tried to believe that God might favor them still. Pilgrims continued to come. The bells of the Holy Sepulchre still rang at dawn. But across the Jordan, Saladin watched and waited. For nearly a decade he had studied his enemies, their tempers, their factions, their greed, and he knew that the time of Christian unity had died with Baldwin IV. In early 1187, provoked by border raids led by the fiery warlord Renaud of Chatillon, Saladin declared jihad. His goal was no longer a campaign of raids, but annihilation. In June 1187, the Sultan marched north from Damascus with nearly 30,000 men, his banners shimmering like waves of green. The crusader host that gathered to meet him was smaller but proud. Perhaps 15,000 knights and footmen, including the Templars and Hospitallers. They assembled at Sepphoris, under the blazing Galilean sun. It was here that Guy de Lusignan faced the first great decision of his reign and made the fatal one. His veteran advisers, Raymond III of Tripoli and the Grand Masters of the Orders, urged caution. They begged him to remain near water and let Saladin's army exhaust itself in the heat. But Guy, goaded by pride and Renaud's arrogance, chose to advance toward Tiberias, where Saladin had trapped Raymond's wife in the fortress. The march began under a sky without clouds, across miles of dry plateau. The Crusaders carried only a few barrels of water, trusting that God would provide. He did not. On 3rd July 1187, as the sun blazed overhead, Saladin's forces cut off the Crusaders' path to the Sea of Galilee. Surrounded near two rocky hills known as the Horns of Hattin, the Christian army found itself trapped in a furnace. The grass was dry as tinder. Saladin's men set it aflame, and choking smoke rolled across the battlefield. The knights' throats cracked, the horses fell, the banners drooped in heat and ash. All day they fought for a sip of water, a breath of mercy. None came. The next morning, Saladin's drums thundered from every side. The Templars formed a desperate wedge and charged, but were engulfed. The true cross, the same relic Baldwin IV had raised at Montresard, was captured after the Bishop of Acre fell beside it. When the smoke cleared, the army of Jerusalem was gone. Thousands lay dead. Thousands more were taken in chains. Only a handful escaped to Tyre and Tripoli. Guy de Lusignan was brought before Saladin's tent, pale and trembling. The Sultan offered him water, the sacred gesture of mercy, and Guy drank greedily. Then the cup was handed to Renaud of Châtillon, whose raids had broken every truce. When Renaud raised it to his lips, Saladin struck him down with his own hand. "It is not fitting that a prince should strike a king," he said calmly to Guy, "but this man is no king." Renaud's blood stained the sand, the first vengeance of the war. The road to Jerusalem now lay open. Within weeks, the Sultan's banners advanced through the valleys of Samaria. City after city surrendered. Nablus, Lydda, Ramla, all yielded without resistance. The few remaining fortresses, Ascalon, Gaza, Kerak, could no longer hold. The people fled to Jerusalem, believing the walls might protect them as they had in the days of the Leper King. But there was no Baldwin IV to rally them now. In September 1187, Saladin encamped before the Holy City. His siege engines pounded the walls day and night. Inside, the patriarch Heraclius led prayers as refugees crowded every street. When the city's defenders, weary soldiers and monks, pleaded for guidance, Heraclius reminded them of Baldwin IV's words, "If God wills me to die, I will die as king." They took heart, but the supplies ran out. After 2 weeks of bombardment, the walls were breached. On the 2nd October 1187, the city that had been the dream of the First Crusade surrendered. Yet what followed was not the slaughter of legend. Saladin entered Jerusalem in peace. He ordered the cross removed from the Dome of the Rock, but forbade the killing of civilians. Ransom prices were set. Those who could not pay were freed through charity. Chroniclers, even Christian ones, wrote with astonishment, "The conqueror showed mercy as though he were already God's chosen." Still, for those who remembered Baldwin IV, the day was heavy with sorrow. In the church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the Leper King lay buried, women wept beside his tomb. They whispered his name, certain that if he had lived, Jerusalem would never have fallen. His grave became a secret place of pilgrimage, the last shrine of a lost kingdom. Outside the walls, Saladin's army knelt to give thanks. From the Mount of Olives, the Sultan looked down at the city gleaming in the evening light. "God gave it to them," he said softly, "and God has taken it away." So ended the kingdom Baldwin IV had given his life to preserve. The towers he built still stood, but their bells no longer rang for Christendom. In the West, when news reached Rome and Paris, churches filled with mourning. Priests said that Jerusalem had fallen not to Muslim swords, but to Christian pride. And among the old knights who had fought beside the Leper King, a single phrase passed from mouth to mouth like a confession. When he died, our courage died with him. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 shook Christendom like an earthquake. Bells tolled across Europe. Churches overflowed with weeping congregations. In Rome, Pope Gregory VIII issued a desperate call. "The holy city lies captive, and the cross is trampled beneath the crescent. Let those who serve the world now serve the Lord." Kings who had long been rivals suddenly shared a single vow: to reclaim what the Leper King had defended with his dying breath. The call became the Third Crusade, the greatest military expedition of the medieval world. Across the cathedrals of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, men took the cross in solemn ceremony. Among them were the mightiest monarchs of the age: Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, soon to be called the Lionheart. Each swore to march east, not merely for Jerusalem, but to avenge Baldwin IV and redeem the shame of Hattin. For those who remembered the Leper King, his memory had already become legend. Monks in Normandy and Templars in Poitou told stories of how he had led men into battle, blind and dying, against the Sultan who now ruled the holy city. Pilgrims called him the White Saint of Jerusalem, saying that his suffering had delayed the city's fall by divine mercy. Even the cynical chroniclers of Europe wrote that his death had been the light's extinguishing before the night. But in the East, the struggle continued long before Europe's armies arrived. After the catastrophe at Hattin, the surviving Crusader states clung to the coast. Tyre, under the leadership of Conrad of Montferrat, became the new bastion of Christian defense. There, banners still bore the Jerusalem cross, a symbol now more sacred in loss than in possession. Baldwin IV's sarcophagus, hidden during Saladin's conquest, became a rallying legend. Knights swore that his spirit still guarded the land, unseen but unbroken. In 1189, the crusade finally reached the shores of Palestine. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa drowned in the Anatolian rivers before reaching the Holy Land, but his soldiers pressed on. The combined armies of England and France landed at Acre, where the Sultan's banners fluttered over the coastal fortress. The siege of Acre would last 2 long years, and through it, Baldwin's name returned again and again in soldiers' prayers. "Remember Baldwin the leper," the knights cried before every charge, as if invoking a ghost. To them, he was not the king who died, but the spirit who refused to yield. In the camps that lined the beaches, old veterans who had fought under his banner told young crusaders of his final ride at Montgessard, how a blind king had carried the true cross and broken Saladin's army. They spoke of his calm, of the way he smiled even in agony, and of his last words, "I have kept the faith." When Richard the Lionheart finally arrived in 1191, the crusading host found new strength. Tall, red-haired, and unyielding, Richard carried with him Baldwin's legend as a personal inspiration. Chroniclers record that the English king visited Baldwin's old strongholds, Ascalon, Jaffa, and the ruins of Kerak, and prayed where the Leper King had once commanded. He ordered his men to rebuild the fortresses in memory of the sainted king who died defending them. Baldwin IV's ghost, it seemed, marched beside him. The war that followed was both brutal and strangely honorable. Saladin, now older and wiser, faced in Richard a mirror of Baldwin's resolve, a rival he could respect. The two leaders exchanged gifts and messages, even as they clashed in battle. When Richard recaptured Acre and defeated Saladin's army at Arsuf on 7 September 1191, many knights claimed it was the vengeance of Baldwin fulfilled. The tide of battle seemed to echo history, another small, miraculous triumph against impossible odds. Yet Jerusalem itself remained beyond reach. Saladin had fortified the city and refused to destroy it, honoring its sanctity even in victory. Richard advanced within sight of its walls but turned back, unwilling to see the holy places fall again through reckless assault. In that moment of restraint, perhaps he understood what Baldwin IV had learned years before, that some victories are spiritual, not territorial. By 1192, the war ended in truce. The Treaty of Ramla allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem freely and secured the coastal cities from Jaffa to Acre. The cross had not been restored over the holy city, but neither had faith been extinguished. For the first time in years, peace, fragile, miraculous peace, settled over the scarred land. In the chronicles that followed, Baldwin IV's shadow loomed over every page. Richard spoke of him often, calling him the truest king of this realm. Saladin, shortly before his death in 1193, referred to him in private conversation. He fought me like a lion, though his flesh was already in the grave. The Leper King had become not just a figure of faith, but a bridge between enemies, a symbol that courage and mercy could coexist even in holy war. Long after the Third Crusade ended, pilgrims visiting the Holy Land sought the place where Baldwin's bones rested. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre had been cleansed and rededicated by Saladin himself. Its lamps burned once more. There, amid the incense and candles, they whispered the same prayer. May we have his courage when our bodies fail. History often forgets kings who win easily. It remembers those who lose beautifully. Baldwin IV belonged to the latter. He did not live to see Jerusalem fall or rise again, yet his spirit guided both. To the crusaders who came after him, he was the silent guardian of their cause, a saint made of suffering, whose name turned despair into duty. And though Richard, Philip, and Saladin would all fade into the chronicles of empire, Baldwin's story endured, not because of his power, but because of his weakness. The boy who could not feel pain had taught the world what true strength was. Centuries have passed since the bells of Jerusalem tolled for the Leper King. The towers he built have crumbled, the banners he carried have faded, and the empire he defended has long vanished into dust. Yet his story still moves through time, like a faint echo, steady, sorrowful, and enduring. Because Baldwin IV was not merely a ruler of stone walls or armies, he was the ruler of his own suffering, and that is a kingdom that never falls. Every generation rediscovers him in some quiet way. Historians speak of his wisdom. Pilgrims whisper his name before the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the faint engraving of his epitaph still survives. Artists paint him veiled and calm, his silver mask glinting in torchlight. Writers describe the impossible paradox he embodied, a dying man who made others believe in life. To his enemies, he was a noble adversary, to his people, a saint. To the centuries that followed, he became something greater still. Proof that courage is not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let it rule you. When we think of the Crusades, we often remember their noise, the clashing swords, the cries of faith and fury. But in Baldwin's story, there is quiet, a quiet strength born from endurance. He never conquered lands, yet he conquered despair. He never crushed his enemies, yet he outlived them in memory. And when everything else collapsed, armies, fortresses, kingdoms, his spirit remained untouched. In many ways, Baldwin IV's short, luminous life is a mirror of our own battles. We may not wear crowns nor fight beneath banners, but we all carry unseen wars within us, fears, wounds, limitations. He reminds us that honor is not in victory, but in perseverance, that greatness lies not in being whole, but in standing tall while broken. If you ever walk the narrow streets of the old city today, beneath the domes and the dust, you might still feel it, a trace of that steadfast soul who once ruled there. In the stillness between the prayer calls and the church bells, something ancient hums softly through the air. It says, "Keep faith, endure, rise even when your strength has left you." For that was Baldwin IV's final lesson, that a frail body can hold an unshakable spirit, and that sometimes the bravest kings are those who fight without hope of healing. And as the night settles over Jerusalem, where the desert wind carries whispers of forgotten prayers, the echo of the Leper King remains, a reminder that faith, once kindled, never truly dies.